Welcome to Diagnosing Dx, the podcast giving diagnostics the platform it deserves. While therapeutics and devices often take centre stage, diagnostics is the engine driving precision medicine. I'm your host, David Philby, and each week we spotlight the innovators, breakthroughs, and real-world challenges shaping the future of DX. This week on Diagnosing Dx, I sat down with Svetlana Nikic, an expert in European diagnostics market access and reimbursement. We unpacked one of the biggest mistakes diagnostic companies make, assuming great science automatically leads to adoption. We discuss how Europe is fundamentally different to the US, why reimbursement takes years, how the evidence bar is higher than most founders expect, and why diagnostics may not have an innovation problem anymore, they have an implementation problem. Svetlana, welcome to the show this week. How are you?
Very good. Thank you, David. Thank you for having me.
Yeah, absolutely. And where are you is probably the most important question.
I'm based in Spain, in Barcelona.
Oh, Barcelona, one of my favourite cities. Amazing. What a great combination of proper city and also coastline.
Agree. It is one of my favorite places. So, yeah.
Yeah. How long have you been in Barcelona?
For 17 years.
Oh, wow. Yeah, amazing. We've got a lot to get through today, but being based in Barcelona probably gives a hint as to what we're going to be covering today. Before we really get into the EU and everything about the industry, give us an introduction to yourself and an insight into your background and career and who you are.
Yeah, great. Thank you, David. So yes, by education, I'm a molecular biologist. I got my PhD at Imperial College in London. And after gaining my PhD, I moved to industry. Then I ended up being 17 years in the diagnostic space for, I think, around 4 or 5 years with Roche Diagnostics in UK and Spain as well. And then I moved to Illumina, that some of our listeners might know. So is one of the leading providers of the next generation sequencing technology. I've been with Illumina for 10 years. Then I moved to a smaller company called C2I Genomics, focused on detection of minimal residual disease. And after C2I, I decided there was a time for a change, and I left as well C2I Genomics, and I started my own consultancy focused on precision oncology.
There we go. I have to ask, when you were with Roche, you didn't happen to go to Welwyn Garden City in the UK?
No.
They had a big manufacturing plant. That's actually where I'm from. Very weird coincidence. Okay. So you've been in the industry a fair amount of time, and now you're focusing on, as a consultant, the consultancy services and angle that you're offering to the industry. Because obviously you've got the PhD background, but that doesn't necessarily mean you've been in sciences your whole career.
Yeah, thank you. No, it's a good question. So I would say that blend of having the scientific background and working in diagnostic industry for a while has really prepared me for where I am today. And so what I'm doing today is I'm really assisting the diagnostic companies. Many of them are US based and trying to come to Europe. Some of them are very small startups. Others are fairly big companies, up to 10,000 employees. And I really help them with digesting and understanding some of these European complexities, I would say, that we have within the diagnostic space, right? So I really assist them in understanding who are the right stakeholders from the clinician perspective, from the payer perspective, whom they need to collaborate with and develop that evidence that is, for instance, needed for achieving the reimbursement, let's say in Spain or Italy. So really trying to, be that's, I would say, the messenger, right, between what we have here in Europe and then what diagnostic providers from US, for instance, need insights in.
So it's much more of a commercial focus, go-to-market and market access reimbursement that you're taking. You're taking the scientific understanding, but you're helping companies translate that into ultimately successful commercial strategies.
Yes, I do prefer to call this more of a market access strategy rather than commercial. I mean, yes, eventually you will generate the revenue, But I do like to think of the strategic market access thinking that companies need to really have in order to achieve those commercial goals. You really need to understand what are the processes, how the lab function in Spain, Italy, Germany, and Sweden, very different processes, different stakeholders. So really trying to help companies navigate, I would say, that European landscape that can be very challenging.
Yeah, that makes sense. So, what point in your career did you first gain exposure to the market access side of the industry, and why was that a move that you decided to pursue? What was it that motivated you to sort of go that direction in your career?
Yeah, well, I think there are probably two events. So obviously, when I was working at Illumina, Illumina is really one of the greatest innovators when it comes to molecular diagnostics. And what I have seen that even though you are great developer of novel diagnostic tools, this does not necessarily translate into implementation, meaning that this does not mean that the patients can actually benefit from your technology. Developing a tool is one thing, but then actually bringing it into what we call routine care, that every patient who is eligible for testing using X diagnostic method can actually benefit from it. It's a very long process and very actually also different across different European countries. So for me, innovation is one thing, but then implementation is a really different thing. And what I have heard at one conference, and I really liked it, and it stayed with me, is that innovation without implementation is only good marketing.
Mhm.
And then the second event was, well, someone very close in my family actually had cancer. And then I could see that when it was, we were talking about diagnostics. Well, one thing again was what we were discussing in industry, at the congresses, at the webinars, there are all this innovation and amazing developments. But again, when you're discussing with, real patients and what sort of diagnostic processes have been maybe undertaken into their specific situation, you can see there's a huge gap. So I would say, going back to your question, really that gap between innovation and implementation is what drove me into getting more sort of involvement into whole market access process.
Right. And so, give me an insight into what your company actually does now, because you've mentioned obviously oncology there as well. So where's your company's sweet spot in terms of the types of clients and products that you're supporting?
Yes. So the name of my consultancy is Precision Oncology Consulting. So I'm focused only on oncology. I think that's already a very complex space, right? So, cancer is a complex disease, complex clinical pathways within hospitals as well. So this is why I really want to stay within that specific market. And in terms of the support that we provide to our customers, we are helping companies to navigate these um, healthcare systems that we have within Europe. So we, for example, have clients who are considering getting reimbursement within European countries, and they try to understand, okay, how can we prioritize? Which country we should prioritize, the number one and number five, and why? So we and my team, so we have now a growing team, we really do this mapping of what is the actual uptake of those diagnostic tools, what is the current status of the reimbursement of potentially competing technology. So really we are trying to map out the current landscape in terms of the tools available, the reimbursement available, and so on. And we also do mapping of the stakeholders, which, some people can think this is fairly simple, but really having a right map of individuals in each of these countries can be very challenging because you need to influence many different stakeholders at the same time, actually, which is also a bit demanding, but it is the way to go. So you need to interact with the clinicians, pathologists, medical oncologists, lab technicians. You need to know who the payers are. Is this private insurance or is it the state's healthcare funds that would fund your diagnostic test? You need to understand those bits and pieces. The medical societies, because in Europe, as you probably know, societies that define the guidelines on what specific test or approach should be used in different contexts are really very important. So Some manufacturers also have those relationships well established, so they interact with those clinicians, obviously always in a compliant way, developing evidence that is needed really to shape those guidelines. And again, a very lengthy process, but something that companies, I would say, need to be involved in. And then also one thing that I do not want to forget, because it is important, and they are getting increasingly more voice into this whole, I would say, market access process, are the patient advocates. Patient advocacy is very important. Bringing the patient voice into the development of your product, into the development of your evidence is really a key.
Hmm. And at what stage are you normally getting involved with companies or even a product? How far along would the product be with regards to, say, EU approvals, or maybe if it's a US company, FDA approvals prior? How early are you getting involved? And I guess, how early would you want to be involved?
Okay, so typically we get involved once the companies have the reimbursement in US, and they might have a CE mark as well, so regulatory mark here in Europe. And the way how we would support them, so we do this mapping exercise, identifying these right stakeholders, and I would say sort of low-hanging fruit from the country perspective. And then when it comes to execution, I have local partners that help with the actual execution. So if someone says, okay, can you, Svetlana, and your team, can you help us with actually getting reimbursement in UK for our digital tool? Then actually I partner with the local folks who really already have those relationships, know the languages. Obviously, UK is not an example of a language barrier, but I'm thinking of France, Italy, Germany. Really, those local market access experts, they help me and my team with the actual execution. Going back to the second part of the question, when I would like to get involved, well, a little bit sooner, I would say my answer is. So obviously, when you start thinking about getting the CE mark, and even when you're getting already, with starting with the reimbursement in US, ideally, I think the companies should already think about the European market, what type of evidence you need, right? Because it is not just, is my test, working well, that sort of performance. That's not sufficient. In Europe, where we need, or what the medical societies and clinicians and the payers are looking for, is really the clinical utility, which is, the impact on the patient outcomes. Do patients live longer and better using your technology compared to what is today's standard of care? And those studies take a lot of time, several years, and they also need specific dedicated funds. So what I would like to see is that companies start thinking and designing the evidence studies earlier. And maybe also a message to the investors. I would also like to see investors providing more funds for this type of evidence generating studies. This is also one big challenge that we see.
Why do you think that doesn't happen sooner at the moment?
Because typically these studies are almost like clinical trials. They require a significant investment. And typically the companies I speak to, right, these are early stage, Series A, sometimes Series B companies, typically Series A, they not necessarily have funds needed to sponsor that kind of clinical trials on their own.
Mm. Do
You
you
see
ever
what I
see a world where clinical trials already conducted for the benefit of FDA approval are easily transferred to European approvals?
At the moment, that is happening to some extent.
Mm.
But then I would say the requirements by European ecosystem are slightly higher. That's
Right.
why, that simple, how you say, transfer of the knowledge and of the data is not easy. Although clinical utility data, are shown also across other countries, can be applied in Europe. It is not that they're
Right.
not useful; they actually are useful. The biggest challenges also comes from what we call cost economics, so health economy studies.
Yep.
Those typically are not really, they need to be local. They need to be done in European environment, right? So,
Yeah.
and that is one of the, I would say, biggest challenges as well that we have observed. So, clinical utility data, if it's really showing the clinical impact, can be leveraged from other regions in Europe, but
Yeah.
it's that, cost effectiveness and budget impact that typically is missing because you do need to involve local health economists, local modeling. In UK, they would value certain things, whereas in Italy is a different kind of cost effectiveness studies that you would need to do. So this is really, I would say, one big challenge for introducing those diagnostic tools into routine.
Yeah, that makes complete sense. Obviously, being from the UK, it makes sense that you see every country individually with its own unique governments, rules, policies, etc. Give us a little bit of a high level intro into, because I think a lot of our US listeners would assume a lot of things about Europe, right? But give us a bit of a high level intro into just market access across the EU and how it typically works and how that breaks down with the different countries and therefore the restrictions it creates with so many different entities.
Okay. Okay. Well, we could talk about this, for a long time. So
That's probably the most broad question I could have asked you, Svetlana.
it's a very broad question. So I would say really, the way how I see a successful market access strategy for a US based diagnostic provider is, identifying a key market, that low hanging market, that would be one specific country, and then developing a market access strategy around that country in question. What that strategy would need to have is really a successful and very clear, what I call KOL engagement strategy.
Hmm.
This goes way beyond inviting that oncologist, to a largest medical oncology congress in US. It is really about developing that relationship, involving that clinician into that evidence generating study that we have mentioned, identifying the health economists that can maybe work with those clinicians on a same study that will, what we call be sort of a decision impact study, study that can show what is the impact for the healthcare system as a whole when your new diagnostic tool is used versus standard of care.
Mm.
So really, defining together with the local clinicians and the health economists, well-designed study. It can be, on a small cohort, but it can also be very effective because you will hopefully address the questions that the local payers are seeking for, right? So again, let's focus maybe on Spain. Then with that local clinician and a local payer, you would design your decision impact study. And as well, at the same time, you have already had connections with the local payers. In Spain, we have additional challenge, which also applies for Italy. The reimbursement is done at the regional level. So in Spain, we have 17 regions. So each region decides the reimbursement, at least for, biomarker testing on their own. And even sometimes those decisions are done at the hospital level.
Wow.
So it is very important to know all of that, I would say, before, right? Designing the evidence generating studies, identifying the right stakeholders. So it is doable, but I think it is very important to have that strategic overview from the early beginning. So whatever you do, it is really aligned with the necessities of those specific regions, of those specific payers. And then so when you develop your studies with those final results, you're going to know you are having the results that are showing what is my budget impact and how actually the regions, for example, in Spain and Italy, can fund and why they should fund the use of those novel diagnostic tools, because they are improving the patient outcomes, but they are also bringing that diagnostic efficiency to the healthcare systems, which at the end is also really important, right? So clinical utility study on its own is not sufficient in most of the regions in Europe.
So you're saying KOL engagement needs to be much more focused on the gathering of evidence internally than it does potentially a sort of external facing role, which could be quite common in the US, where you're engaging a KOL to sort of, you're trying to you're trying to bridge gaps between relationships, but you're actually saying KOL engagement is about bringing them in and guiding evidence so that long term you'll be successful in your goals.
Absolutely, absolutely. And these, experts, they're individuals that are really the leaders in the space of oncology and in other diseases, right? This is what definition is, key opinion leader. And these individuals are also very influential at the level of the medical societies. They might be also part of, the teams who are updating the clinical guidelines, which we have mentioned earlier. They're really important in Europe for getting the reimbursement. And one thing that I would like to mention that updating guidelines such as NCCN in US are actually very different and easier than updating guidelines at ESMA by European Medical Society of Oncology. So I would say really having KOLs seen as your partners in this whole
Yeah.
process is important. And also KOLs, are discussing with the bodies such as, the healthcare institutions who are really very much involved in all those evaluation processes of novel diagnostic tools.
Mm. So you mentioned potentially highlighting low-hanging fruit markets initially as your sort of first land and then expand strategy. What makes one country more accessible than another? And is there an element of it that is product specific because there's something about that product that country and region is missing or craving?
Yeah, that's a very good question, David. So obviously, one can always think, oh, well, Germany is one of the low-hanging fruit. It is very advanced when it comes to diagnostic, and it's a large market.
Hmm.
But one needs to think as well. This is where I work with my local experts. For example, thinking about there's a lot of hype around the digital tools, right? And digital tools are being reimbursed from different funds than the rest of the diagnostic medtech devices. So if you are a developer of a novel diagnostic tool that is a digital AI-based tool, you would want to know, okay, which country potentially is now putting more emphasis, is providing more funds for digital tools, because that's the country that you would want to go and potentially seek the reimbursement rather than another country where maybe, you see, there's no any funds for digital tools. It might be a large country, but if there is no any dedicated fund, then I would probably say, okay, well, maybe that is not our low-hanging fruit in that specific context. So I would say it is to some extent product specific. And obviously, I would also say it depends again on the competitors, right? Competitive landscape. So I think this does go back to the comment about product specificity, right? Sometimes having competitors on the market help these Me Too solutions to potentially get reimbursement if they are better slightly than their competitor. And then others might perceive this actually as a barrier. So I think I've actually observed both situations.
So actually, you're saying that different countries it's about staying up to date with current policies and therefore the actual funds being available for this type of product, but then also knowing the competition, because the landscape could be that if there's already a precedent, that can be less barriers to entry, but if there's too much competition, there could be a barrier in that why do we need another type of product that's we feel like we've got enough. So it's really, you've really got to know that local market and how it's going to work.
Exactly, exactly. And so this is where again we go back to that evidence, right? And this is what we have also done
Yeah.
for a couple of clients of mine, where we also worked on developing what we call value dossier. So typically these are documents where you really digest all of that evidence, created either by your own company or by competitors, because that is the evidence. So if you look into the space of MRD, minimal residual disease, for example, a company such as Natera, which are really leading that space, they have developed huge and very important amount of clinical utility data for the MRD that now, potentially newcomers are still, making benefit of that clinical utility data, and that is
Yeah.
fine. So going back to my, answer to you is that I would say, digesting all of that data into value dossier, where you really show to the payers what is the benefit of your test from that clinical perspective and economic perspective, then, in that way, you make a stronger case for the local payers, and they can really see what is the benefit of your assay versus a competitor, right?
Right, that makes complete sense. And so let's touch on reimbursement specifically, because reimbursement in the US is a word that is at the forefront of every product conversation, every startup, and rightly so, right? If
Yes.
companies are not tackling reimbursement early, they're probably just going to fail. How does reimbursement differ in the EU, especially in countries where you have, obviously I'll use the UK as a very strong example, where we have the National Healthcare Service. How does reimbursement, how is it similar? And how is it as important as it is in the US? But also, where is it different, and what should US companies be aware of so that they're coming into this region with sort of eyes wide open?
Yeah. So I would say, one of the important bits is, and I would assume that most of the US companies know that, right? That, private insurance in Europe is not, as how you say, as present as in US, right? So I think in some countries is up to 25%. That's, I think, maximum
Right.
of the number of the citizens that have private insurance, and that's typically in addition to what they have, right, by the national healthcare funds. So typically these novel diagnostic tools, and when we think about them, getting them reimbursed by the national healthcare systems, right, they are offered by the public systems in most of the situations. So that means that you need to get the reimbursement from the national government's funds, right? For example, in case of Spain, how does that work? So you have funds from the state that are being distributed to those regions that I said to you. We have 17 regions in Spain, but then the regions decide how they will use that fund, on what specific, diagnostics, therapeutics, and so on. So in terms of the actual amounts, right? So in Europe, I would say the pricing typically, needs to be less aggressive. It's just that, we typically, cannot pay, nor out of pocket, nor, government would not pay 3,000-4,000 euros for specific test, right? Although you can then argue, but if the overall healthcare impact is positive, still, the cost of the diagnostic tests today is actually, evaluated and has some, I would say, challenges when being evaluated by the local systems. So what I want to say that, US companies shouldn't think about coming to European market and, first of all, thinking that they can get the same reimbursement levels in terms of the rates as what we
Yeah.
have in as what they have in US. That will be very difficult. But really, they need to think about how they can actually introduce their tests to impact the whole, I would say, pathway, clinical pathway where their solution fits, right? If you position your solution as a solution that impacts the whole pathway, and then potentially you having a cost saving, that will be perceived by the payers as a test with positive outcomes.
Not to put you on the spot, because I know I'm about to ask a question that maybe can't be answered specifically, but if a US company has a certain price agreed at reimbursement in the US and they intend to come to Spain, for example, what's a typical or estimated cost that they would be able to get in Spain, like as a percentage?
That's difficult to answer, or that's literally, I think, not possible to be answered. What if you have a company from US that is being reimbursed, let's say $3,000 in US, they already have shown a strong clinical utility data in US. Potentially, they could get reimbursed around 3K here in Europe, but they
Okay.
do need to show that cost effectiveness, because ideally, let's assume that tests identifies better compared to current standard of care, which patients benefit from targeted therapies, right? You will spend your funds on therapeutic choices more wisely. You will not give those expensive drugs to patients who do not benefit. So hopefully the overall budget impact will be positive for the national healthcare system in Spain or for the regional healthcare system. And that actually results, those kind of studies will enable that company to potentially get even high rate of the reimbursement. But you do need to show that impact on the overall healthcare system in terms of finances.
So do you think the bar is higher in European countries to get... You're nodding aggressively halfway through.
Yes.
Really?
Yes, absolutely. And this is actually why, we are going back to one of our initial comments, right? When I would like those companies to engage with my consultancy or other consultancies that are doing similar things, well, as soon as they almost get the reimbursement in US, and I know most of those companies then are focusing on commercial activities in US, but that's the time when they need to think about what evidence we need to develop for European market, for that one European country that we decide to focus on, what economic evidence we need to develop, and start actually doing that study, which typically would take around 4 or 5 years. You would then ideally need to publish that. So yes, the bar in terms of the evidence level is higher because, again, you need both economical and clinical utility evidence. And, you need time to actually show that you're changing patient outcomes, right? So sometimes you're looking into progression-free survival. If your endpoint is overall survival, your study needs to be longer. So again, it also depends a lot on what diagnostic tool we are talking about, what setting, is it advanced disease, early stage? It gets a bit tricky.
Yeah. And so dealing with governments, even and local government entities, maybe this is the Brit in me, but dealing with the UK government for anything is horrific. It's absolutely painful, and that includes the NHS, right? It's such a difficult system to navigate in terms of like hoops to jump through and just speaking to... So my opinion of these things is very low anyway. Is it difficult for companies to deal with the right people in certain countries? Is it make it difficult because it's this centralized agency that you have to deal with?
Of course. I mean, you can think about, again, Spain and Italy, where you have these different, I think Italy has 20 regions, Spain 17. So imagine a company coming here, let's say they want to go to the Spanish market. You need to know the local stakeholders, and but it is doable. I do want to stay on a positive note. Companies, what they do, if they cannot have a local team on the ground that speaks the local language, these are typical governmental affairs, right? Public affairs individuals within larger companies, they do exactly that. They speak with the ministers of health and really trying to change and shape the policies, which is, again, a big task, but many companies are doing that. And I will also use the opportunity just to mention that there are also several coalitions, and I can maybe mention that now actually I'm working as secretariat on one of those coalitions. So this is a European coalition for comprehensive genomic profiling. What is great about that effort, that this is an effort actually kicked off from Brussels, right? So really focused on changing the policy. And that coalition is really gathering different providers from the diagnostic space and pharma industry as well. And really collectively, as a coalition, they're trying to influence and shape the policy so that more patients can benefit from what we call comprehensive genomic profiling. Basically, this is the molecular profiling that enables better and more accurate and faster identification of patients that can benefit from effective targeted therapies.
Mm.
So I would say that this type of efforts at the European level, the coalitions, and in Europe, there's a lot of now initiatives that are bringing a lot of stakeholders together who collectively are trying to make a change because they know that company on its own will have, more challenges to influence and shape those different stakeholders I mentioned.
Yeah. My assumption, to be positive, my assumption would be, and correct me if I'm wrong, is that because everything is sort of government run, that once you're in, it would be a very stable, profitable market, right? Once you've got over the long hump of getting through all the hoops and you're like, okay, we are now into these systems in this country. Actually, this is we're in a really good space now, and that for me would sort of, but am I right with that assumption, or is there still, a lot of hard work to do once things are in place?
Absolutely, absolutely. So that is again part of what we call access story, right? Even looking into the pharma industry, right? So you can have a specific drug approved, let's
Mm.
say in Italy,
Hmm.
but you do not actually have a diagnostic test that identifies the patient who can benefit from your drug.
Yeah.
That's an access issue.
Mm.
So I would say that applies to both therapeutics and diagnostics. So when you have new diagnostic tools, let's say reimbursed, implementation, introducing your test in the rest of the workflow, right? Because a pathology lab, has a lot of different tools, a lot of solutions. They
Yeah.
basically need their life easier and more effective, right? From
Mm.
the I would say operational perspective. So you really need to think about implementation. Is yours, company developing, I don't know, AI solution that needs access to a huge server? Well, that infrastructure component will be an important bottleneck
Mm.
impacting your access, right? And one thing that we haven't mentioned, and I do think is important as well, we can think about US companies. So, in spite of those complexities that we have in Europe, obviously, this is still an important and very big market. Obviously, I would say also all of the pharmaceutical companies are present here with their drugs, with their medicines, right? So if you are providing a diagnostic tool that potentially is identifying patients who can benefit from a specific drug, or an AI tool that can predict relapse sooner than later, pharma is interested in
Mm.
having access to these tools in the countries where they have their drugs. So
Right.
I think it's also very important to think, in spite of these complexities that we have brought up, patients are still there. Patients need to benefit from those therapies, but for therapies to be, accessed successfully in an equitative manner, you do need to have diagnostic present.
Yeah, that makes sense. So partnering with pharma companies through your journey is a great way to accelerate things and improve the uptake. That makes
Yes.
sense.
Yeah.
Uh, One small question. You mentioned out of pocket, which is obviously a big part of the US healthcare system. Does that exist in certain markets, or is that something that's not a part of what companies should be aiming for?
It does. It does. So I know I was a little bit maybe critical out of pocket payment because I'm all for, equitative access.
Yep.
But it is true that some of these innovative solutions are initially accessible only through the private sector. And
Mm-hmm.
that is happening. So I know that is happening in Spain and Italy, right? These countries where the public healthcare system is very strong and provides a good care to their citizens, still, the private insurers do get access to maybe some of these MRD tests that we have mentioned earlier that cost 3 to 4 thousand. Through the private sector, they get it. And it is true that this is actually a solution that I have discussed with some of my clients as a sort of a way to open up the doors in different countries, right? You introduce your technology, you establish that relationship with the KOLs who are also working in the private sector. So that sometimes is a way to get into the local systems as well. So I'm happy you brought that question up, David.
Okay. Makes sense. And so a couple of final questions. What are the biggest mistakes or common mistakes that you see sort of US companies make and that they should avoid as they aim for the EU?
I would say that, reaching out to local experts, local consultants such as myself, happens too late.
Mm-hmm.
And the fact that it needs a lot of time to develop that clinical evidence, local clinical evidence, but then also really local economic evidence data is something that is, I would say, underestimated. So I always say
Right.
at least plan early. Maybe if, company does not have funds to execute, at least, plan those studies early on, identify the right stakeholders early on, and start that KOL engagement early. Because again, these KOLs are very busy individuals. They are speaking and working with many different companies in addition to running their own clinical practice. But again, having those, solid relationships to develop takes time as well. So I would say really have your KOL engagement strategy in place, stepwise process with, KOL engagement. And through that KOL engagement, you could start, and they will for sure help you to develop that evidence and, economic evidence that you would need for the local payers.
That makes sense. And where do you see the biggest unmet needs that need to be sort of addressed and targeted over the next few years?
So unmet need from the clinical perspective, implementation perspective, from which perspective?
Clinical. Let's do clinical perspective across Europe. Where do you see the exciting markets that companies from the US should be coming over for?
To be honest, I think, the innovation has been incredible in the diagnostic space for a very long time now. I would say we don't need more innovation. We now need companies to really focus on implementing their solution, to start, interaction with the local stakeholders and to work on the reimbursement. Because still in Europe, the uptake of what we call biomarker testing, is very low. So still we have too many patients who are not benefiting from these very effective targeted therapies, immune therapies.
Yeah.
So I'm very much about, we don't need to innovate anymore, but really let's think about how to implement, how to maybe collaborate with another provider, right? Because that cancer care pathway is so long, right? We go from electronic health records, from sample acquisition, we have clinical records, we have genomic records, we have radiomics now, we have all these AI tools. There's interpretation needs, right? There's a data that needs to be stored. Patients need to be tracked. Patient need to be tracked when it comes to, how you say this, compliance with, drug actually usage. So there's, I would say we need to really think holistically. So I would like to see more of companies really collaborating with each other towards, that joint implementation. And ultimately, maybe it's not possible to get a joint reimbursement, but really to see how can we work together to implement our solution, because there's too many companies, everyone thinks that their solution will solve and, will eradicate the cancer. No single solution will do that. So I'm really, all up for that holistic view of cancer care and partnerships.
Love that. Focus on implementation, not innovation. I think that's a really good point. There's some fantastic science out there that needs to be in the hands of physicians and therefore patients. Svetlana, before I let you go, what's your overview of the diagnostics market in 2026? Where are we? Are we on? Do we have positive momentum? Are we optimistic? Are things progressing? What's your opinion?
Things are progressing. If I'm optimistic, I have to be, right? We need to hope always for better. In terms of the innovation, as what we said, right? I think there's a amazing momentum in, again, I'm speaking on the behalf of the diagnostics in oncology, huge amount of tools to identify the patients that can benefit from therapy. huge amount of tools that can help identify patients who are not responding, who might have a relapse. So again, and also AI, right? AI is gonna also change the way how we're doing diagnostics. It is super exciting. I just hope that the healthcare systems will also enable implementation of these tools, right? So again, in terms of the innovation, I think the progress is amazing, but where we need now changes is really at the policy level, right? We need these policy stakeholders and the evaluators of new technologies to work with the manufacturers, to work with different stakeholders, with different coalitions, and really sort of, have more standardized ways on how diagnostic tools are being evaluated and being reimbursed. Really eliminate some of those sort of, I would say, systemic structural barriers that we have.
I like that, Svetlana. Thank you for your insights, and thank you for coming on the show today. This was awesome. I actually feel like we got into the sort of bit more granular, and which was great. Like, I'm glad that we sort of got to pick out little points of which are really important hurdles. But thank you so much for coming on and giving us your time and your perspective on all things EU.
Thank you, David. It was very pleasure.
Speak to you soon.
Speak to you soon. Take care. Bye.